He was born in silence. The palace was ready. Velvet curtains had been pressed, candles lit, golden robes laid out. The cradle stood beneath a painted ceiling of cherubs and saints, fit for a god, not a child. And yet, when he came, the joy was brief. The nurses whispered. The midwife paused. No loud cry, no fierce kicking, no royal strength. Just a baby, still, soft, and strangely quiet. His jaw didn't move like it should. His eyes darted, not steady. He couldn't feed. He barely breathed, but he was born a king to the world. He would be known as Charles II of Spain, a child of divine blood, ruler of empires. But to the ones who stood near the crib that night, he was something else, a question, a warning, a whisper behind the crown. His name was Charles, but he was no ordinary child. Born in 1661 into the House of Habsburg, rulers of Spain, Austria, and beyond, Charles II carried more than a title. He carried a family tree that twisted back upon itself like a serpent devouring its own tail. His mother was also his father's niece. His grandparents had been uncle and niece, and the pattern continued, generation after generation, in pursuit of purity. From the outside, the court celebrated his birth. Spain had an heir. The dynasty would live on. The bells rang. Church choirs echoed with praise. Paintings were commissioned before the child had even opened his eyes. But inside the royal nursery, silence hung thick. Charles struggled to suckle. His tongue was unusually large, his jaw weak and recessed, a grotesque echo of what history now calls the Habsburg jaw. His head was too large for his body. His muscles lacked tone. He was limp in the arms of his wet nurse. By the time he was 2, Charles could not stand. He drooled constantly. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in slow, garbled fragments. Servants whispered that he was bewitched. Priests were summoned. Holy relics were brought into his bedroom to ward off evil, but no exorcism could cure his broken body, because Charles was not cursed by demons. He was the product of generations of inbreeding, a slow, tragic collapse of the royal bloodline in pursuit of false perfection. At court, his every weakness was hidden. When portraits were painted, the artists softened his chin. When he was presented before nobles, he was dressed in heavy layers to cover his thin limbs. When he was wheeled through public parades, his attendants smiled, but behind their masks, they were terrified. Because Charles II wasn't just a child. He was the last hope of the Habsburg dynasty. If he died, the kingdom would fracture. If he lived, Spain would be ruled by a boy who could barely hold a quill. By age 10, Charles had still not learned to read. He could barely eat solid food. His tutors tried, gently, to teach him letters, numbers, scripture, but most days, the lessons ended in confusion and frustration. And yet, he was heir to the most powerful empire in the world. He signed documents with trembling hands. He nodded at foreign ambassadors, though he barely understood their language. He sat in the grand halls of Madrid, below ceilings gilded with gold, while his body betrayed him, quietly, day by day. The people never knew the full truth. To them, he was a sickly king, unmarried, childless, melancholic. To his inner circle, he was a portrait propped up on a crumbling frame, and to the physicians who examined him in private, he was living proof of what happens when blood is locked in a gilded cage. He was Charles II, King of Spain. And yet, in many ways, he was never allowed to be a boy. The year was 1661. Spain was still an empire, vast, sun-drenched, powerful on maps. Its territories stretched across Europe, the Americas, and parts of the East. Gold and silver poured in from the New World. Ships returned heavy with spices, silks, and slaves. Cathedrals reached for the sky, and the King of Spain was called His Catholic Majesty, a title meant to echo the voice of God himself. But inside the royal palace of Madrid, something was breaking. The walls were covered in tapestries, woven with images of saints and victories long past. The air smelled faintly of incense, wax, and aging wood. Servants moved quietly through cold stone corridors, their footsteps swallowed by thick carpets. Candles flickered constantly, not for mood, but because sunlight barely reached through the narrow windows. The court wore black, not as mourning, but as fashion, a somber display of dignity and distance. Spain, once bold and fearsome, had become tired. The kings who once rode out into battle on horseback now sat behind velvet curtains, surrounded by whispering advisors and echoing prayers. The palace was heavy with silence, not the silence of peace, but of careful performance. Every corner of royal life was designed to uphold an image: the divine bloodline, the perfect ruler, the never-ending power of God's chosen family. But under the gold leaf and marble columns, there was rot, economic rot, political rot, and, most of all, genetic rot. Charles II was born into this. His bedroom was not a child's nursery. It was a shrine, a place of watchfulness and worry. Every object chosen, not for comfort, but for presentation. Ornate cradles, holy relics, crosses, silk sheets stitched with the Habsburg crest. Even as an infant, he was more symbol than son. The people outside the palace saw a nation led by holiness and might. But inside, behind the sealed doors of the royal apartments, doctors and priests stood in the same room, both unsure of what they were treating. Spain itself was trapped in illusion. Its territories were vast, but difficult to control. Its wealth was great, but unevenly spread. And its rulers, the Habsburgs, had long chosen bloodline over breadth, marrying siblings, cousins, and nieces to protect their power. By the mid-1600s, their most precious possession, their DNA, had become their most dangerous secret. Charles II's world was filled with music, prayer, paintings, and protocol, but beneath it all was silence. Not a peaceful silence, but the kind that follows fear, the kind that wraps itself around a palace when everyone knows. But no one says what is truly wrong. This was his world, beautiful, gilded, holy, and slowly dying. The Habsburgs were not like other families. For centuries, they ruled Europe like chess masters, calculating, strategic, and ruthless in pursuit of control. They didn't just build armies or castles. They built bloodlines, carefully, precisely, and dangerously. Their motto was whispered in Latin through the halls of every court they touched: "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry, and marry they did, cousin to cousin, niece to uncle, aunt to nephew, over and over, again generation after generation." To outsiders, these unions were political genius, a way to avoid war by binding crowns together in the cradle. Spain and Austria, Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, Hungary, Bohemia, all stitched together through rings, not swords. But inside the family, something darker was happening. The Habsburg family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a circle, a closed loop, branches that curled inward until they became tangled knots of shared blood. By the time Charles II was born, his inbreeding coefficient, a genetic measurement of how closely related his parents were, was higher than that of the offspring of full siblings. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was also his father's niece, and their own parents were themselves products of prior intermarriage. This wasn't accidental. It was by design. The belief was simple and deadly: royal blood must not mix with common blood. The purer the lineage, the closer to God. Kings were not to be deluded by the people they ruled. But the cost of this divine delusion was hidden in the next generation. As the gene pool shrank, recessive traits began to rise, traits that should have been weeded out by nature. Physical deformities, developmental delays, immune weaknesses, infertility. They appeared quietly at first: a slow speech delay, an unusually prominent jaw, a child with a weak constitution, but no one spoke of it. These were royal children. They were not questioned. They were blessed until they were not. Doctors whispered behind closed doors. Priests performed blessings that lingered too long. Artists softened features in portraits to hide what was too real. Nurses were instructed to remain silent, because to speak of weakness in the blood was to question the throne itself, and the throne could not be questioned, so the marriages continued. Even as the children grew stranger, even as infant coffins quietly piled in royal chapels, even as kings aged without heirs, and queens wept alone in marble corridors. This was the truth Charles II was born into, not just a fragile body, but a crumbling dynasty, a bloodline that had folded so far inward, it could no longer stand to understand why no one stopped the decay. You have to understand what they believed. Royalty was not just power, it was divinity. Kings and queens were not merely leaders of nations, they were chosen by God. They sat on thrones, not by chance, but by sacred right. Their bloodlines were not political assets. They were holy relics, touched by heaven, protected by tradition, and so anything that threatened that purity was treated as heresy. The concept of royal blood was more than metaphor, it was doctrine. Every drop was considered sacred, too sacred to risk. With outsiders, marriage to commoners was unthinkable. Marriage to equals other royals, even relatives, was mandatory. When the Pope crowned emperors, he didn't simply bless a man, he affirmed a bloodline, a divine continuity from king to son to grandson, unbroken by impurity. But what the Church blessed nature could not sustain, by the 1600s, European courts had begun to notice. The children were weaker, the infant deaths more frequent, the kings less capable. But instead of asking whether the system was flawed, they asked whether God was angry. They prayed harder, they anointed more, they blamed sin, witches, enemies, anything except the truth. Because the truth was unspeakable, that the very thing they protected, their bloodline, was killing them. And so, the lie deepened. When Charles II failed to speak, they said he was contemplative. When he couldn't walk, they said he was blessed with stillness. When he couldn't father a child, they said God's timing was mysterious. Doctors were pressured to lie. Servants were sworn to silence. Portraits were carefully adjusted. The jaw softened. The eyes brightened. The body steadied with painted illusion. This lie was woven into every court ceremony, every public appearance, every sermon spoken in cathedral halls, and the people believed it because they had to. The alternative was too terrifying, that the empire they worshipped was rotting from the inside out. Some courtiers knew, quietly, painfully. A few whispered warnings, a few advised against yet another cousin marriage, but they were dismissed, exiled, forgotten. Because the lie was safer. A divine bloodline was more comforting than a broken one. A sacred family was easier to love than a dying one. And so they bowed deeper, married closer, prayed louder, and every year, the children grew sicker. The lie had taken root, not just in palace walls, but in the minds of an entire empire, and by the time Charles II came of age, the truth could no longer be hidden. It walked beside him, it sat on his throne, it looked back from every mirror he could not understand. He was crowned King of Spain at just 4 years old, a small boy in a throne, too large, draped in gold and velvet, surrounded by men who spoke for him, thought for him, ruled in his name. The crown was carefully placed on his head, but even then it seemed to weigh too much. He could barely hold it up. Charles II would remain king for 35 years, but in truth, he never truly ruled. As he grew older, his weaknesses became impossible to disguise. His speech was slow, slurred, and often incomprehensible. He drooled constantly, his mouth open due to his deformed jaw. He could not chew food properly, and he often suffered from intense stomach pain. His legs were thin and frail. His body could not support a sword. He walked rarely, rode never, and yet he wore the garments of an emperor in public ceremonies. He was guided gently by servants. His robes were tailored not for comfort, but to conceal layers upon layers, to mask the thinness of his frame. His portraits were softened by royal artists, the eyes painted brighter, the mouth closed, the skin smoother, but no paint could hide the truth for long. Behind closed doors, ministers argued in hushed tones. Who would really rule? Who could protect the empire while the king stared blankly from his throne? Court factions grew stronger. The Queen Mother dominated for years. Later, foreign advisors, bishops, and courtiers took turns whispering in his ear. Decisions were made in his name: war, taxes, marriage, while Charles remained a symbol, not a sovereign. Marriage became the next desperate attempt to save the dynasty. He was wed first to Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess, young, hopeful, and frightened. She tried to please him. She tried to bear a child. But the marriage remained cold, and there were whispers that Charles did not understand what was expected of a husband. After her death, some said from sorrow, he was married again, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg. She too tried. She too failed. There were no children, no heir, no future. Physicians examined the king with growing concern. Some believed he was sterile. Others blamed sorcery, curses, or sin. One doctor reportedly told the court, "The king's body is the seat of every illness known to man." Still, they kept praying. Still, they kept hiding. But Spain was falling. The once great empire now suffered economic collapse. Wars drained its coffers. Colonies rebelled. The people starved while the court debated divine providence. And all the while, Charles grew thinner, sicker, more confused. His memory faltered. His hands trembled. His mind wandered. He spoke of visions, of demons, of strange voices in the night, in his final years. He was barely present at all, a broken king in a golden cage. He died in 1700, at the age of 38, childless, weak, alone. His body, when examined, was horrifying. His intestines were putrid and rotted. His brain was soft, his lungs diseased. He had only one working testicle, and it was described as atrophied. His autopsy read more like a battlefield than a human being, and with his death, the Spanish Habsburg line ended. A dynasty that had ruled for centuries, extinguished by the very thing it tried to preserve. Its blood. The empire mourned. Bells rang, masses were held, statues were unveiled. But no one could deny what had truly happened. The throne had broken, long before Charles ever sat on it. His body simply made the fracture visible. The body of Charles II was not just a medical mystery, it was treated as a spiritual one. His misshapen jaw, his constant illness, his delayed mind, these were not seen as symptoms of a genetic collapse, because no one dared speak of such things. The idea that the royal bloodline, sacred, ordained, untouchable, could carry disease was unthinkable. So they looked elsewhere. 2 demons, 2 witches, 2 curses, 2 God's displeasure. By the time Charles was 5, his condition had already terrified those closest to him. Servants crossed themselves when they entered his room. Priests lingered in hallways, murmuring prayers. Court astrologers whispered that his stars were darkened. Some claimed the boy had been cursed by enemies of the crown. Others insisted he was born under an evil influence, a punishment for the sins of his ancestors. And so, the rituals began. Holy water sprinkled across his bedding, relics of saints placed under his pillows, chants spoken in Latin over his food and bath. The boy, frail, confused, and mostly silent, was treated not as a patient, but as a vessel of supernatural danger. His nurses were instructed never to speak of his condition outside palace walls. If they did, they would be dismissed, or worse, accused of treason. But the rumors still spread. In 1677, an official exorcism was performed. Charles, then 16, was taken into a chamber of the palace, surrounded by bishops and holy men. Candles were lit. Incense filled the air. Sacred texts were read aloud. The boy sat still, eyes blank, unable to comprehend the meaning of what was being said. A crucifix was pressed against his forehead. Holy oil anointed his limbs. They prayed. They chanted. They begged the spirits to release the king. But nothing changed. The church recorded the ritual as complete. The royal physicians noted no improvement. And the court went silent again, tucking the event away like a bad dream. It was never spoken of publicly. Not even when Charles began speaking of visions, or when he claimed he was being watched, at night, by invisible figures. The truth was unbearable. Not just that Charles was sick, but that his sickness had no cure. No prayer would fix him. No relic would mend his bones. No marriage would produce an heir. And no exorcism could remove what was not a demon, but a genetic inheritance. In private moments, his mother reportedly wept. His wives grew distant, and Charles, the boy who had been born into silence, continued to live within it. He wasn't evil. He wasn't cursed. He was just broken. A child who was never allowed to be a child. A man who was made a king, but denied the right to be simply human. By the end of his life, Charles was deeply devout. He clung to rosaries, attended mass daily, confessed often. He believed, maybe he had too, that his suffering had purpose, that his pain was God's test, not nature's verdict. But history sees more clearly now. He was not tested. He was trapped. Not by demons, but by blood. She was not born to rule, but she ruled longer than almost any monarch before her. Queen Victoria, the emblem of 19th century power, progress, and British pride, wore her crown for more than 60 years. Under her reign, the British Empire expanded to nearly a quarter of the globe. She became known as the grandmother of Europe, not just for her political influence, but for the children and grandchildren she scattered across royal families. From London to St. Petersburg, from Berlin to Madrid. But along with her royal titles and ceremonial robes, Queen Victoria carried something else, something smaller than a crown, something no one could see, something that would spill quiet tragedy across generations, a mutation in a single gene on the X chromosome. Hemophilia. It was not visible on her face, it left no mark on her skin, but in the blood of her sons and grandsons, it would become a death sentence. Hemophilia is a disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. A bruise can become a hemorrhage. A small cut can become fatal. Internal bleeding can occur without warning. There were no treatments at the time, no blood transfusions, no clotting factor injections, just silence, prayer, and fear. Victoria's 8th child, Prince Leopold, was the first to suffer. He bruised easily. He bled longer than other boys. A minor fall could leave him bedridden for days. Doctors eventually understood what they were seeing, but they had no way to stop it. Leopold died at age 30 from a cerebral hemorrhage after a minor hip injury, but the legacy did not end with him. Victoria had already married off her daughters to other royal houses, and unknowingly, they carried the same gene. Her granddaughter, Princess Alex, would marry Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, becoming Tsarina Alexandra. Their son, Alexia, would inherit the disease. So would other grandsons in Spain and Germany. Across Europe, whispers began again. Royal boys who bled from the nose and never stopped. Princes with bandaged limbs who couldn't play. Heirs who vanished from public life, replaced with formal portraits and rumors. The press was not allowed to speak openly. Families issued vague statements. Delicate constitution, recovering from minor illness. But inside the palaces, the truth was known. Queen Victoria's blood had become a ghost. It moved silently. It struck at random, and no crown could protect against it. The irony was unbearable. She was the symbol of power, family, and stability, but she had unknowingly passed on a gene that would help bring empires to their knees. No one blamed her. No one could, in her time. The science was unknown. Genetics was still a whispered theory. The idea that something invisible could pass from mother to child, silently, unpredictably, was still far from common knowledge. But history sees the pattern. A single mutation, a royal dynasty, a river of blood, flowing unseen beneath golden. Thrones. His name was Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov. He was the only son of Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra, the heir to the Russian throne, a child born into splendor, baptized in gold and incense, dressed in velvet, guarded by soldiers. But his body was fragile. He inherited his mother's eyes, her pale skin, her quiet nature, and from her bloodline, Queen Victoria's bloodline, he inherited something else, hemophilia. The boy could not stop bleeding. A bruise on his leg could swell like a balloon, dark and hot with internal blood. A fall on the palace steps could mean weeks in bed, crying in pain. He was rarely allowed to run. He was never allowed to fight, or climb, or play like other boys. At first, the illness was kept secret. The court issued vague updates. The boy was resting. He was indisposed. But inside the royal chambers, Alexandra was unraveling. She blamed herself. She prayed. She watched her son scream in agony while the doctors stood helplessly by. Alexei was the only male heir to the Romanov dynasty. Without him, the royal succession was in jeopardy. Alexandra, already distrusted by the Russian people for her German heritage, became consumed by her son's survival. She withdrew from court life. She focused only on his care. And then, a name appeared, whispered at first, then spoken louder: Grigory Rasputin, a wandering Siberian monk, a mystic, a healer, a man of rough appearance, long beard, and hypnotic eyes. They said he had powers, strange, dark powers. He could ease pain. He could slow bleeding. He could save Alexei at Tsarina. Desperate, let him in, and something changed. When Rasputin prayed over Alexei, the bleeding seemed to stop. Not always, not completely, but often enough to feel like a miracle. Enough for a mother who had no other hope. Rasputin became more than a guest. He became essential, a shadow, always nearby, a name always whispered through palace halls. The royal doctors objected. The ministers objected. Even the Tsar hesitated. But Alexandra defended him fiercely. "He is the only one who can save my son," she said. And so, Rasputin remained. But the Russian people saw what was happening. They saw a strange man with no noble blood whispering in the queen's ear. They saw influence they didn't understand. They saw a court, distracted, unstable, blind to their suffering. Russia was already struggling. War, poverty, hunger, and now, a bleeding boy, a secret illness, a mystic in the palace. Whispers became rumors. Rumors became anger. The Tsar's image collapsed. The people's faith in the monarchy crumbled. The revolution began to stir. No one knew the full truth. They didn't know that behind the silk curtains, the heir to the throne cried out in pain, unable to move. That his mother wept and lit candles all night. That Rasputin's power came not from sorcery, but from timing. And perhaps calm. Modern historians now believe his healing may have been simple. He kept doctors away, and at the time, royal doctors often gave aspirin, a drug that thins the blood. Rasputin may have saved Alexei, not by magic, but by preventing poison. But the damage was done. Rasputin was murdered in 1916, stabbed, shot, poisoned, and drowned. The monarchy fell a year later. The Romanovs were imprisoned. And in 1918, Alexei was shot alongside his parents. his sisters, and his dreams. A child who never had a chance. A dynasty brought down, not just by politics, but by blood. The gene that began in Queen Victoria had reached its cruelest destination. In the basement of a house in Yekaterinburg, the story ended. The last Romanov bled. One final time, in the span of just one generation, the royal houses of Europe began to fracture, not with gunshots or coups, but with silence and blood. It began with children who never grew strong, princes who couldn't walk without bruising, heirs who couldn't eat without bleeding, marriages that produced no children, dynasties that reached for eternity and fell before the century was over. By the early 1900s, three of Europe's most powerful monarchies had begun to crumble under the same quiet force: genetic fragility. The Romanovs fell in 1917. Nicholas II had already lost the people's trust. But it was Alexei, the boy who bled, who made the royal family vulnerable to manipulation and superstition. Rasputin's influence eroded public confidence. The monarchy was seen as cursed, weak, out of touch. The revolution that followed was political, yes, but its roots were buried in generational fear, hidden illness, and imperial silence. In Spain, hemophilia struck again. Queen Victoria's granddaughter, Princess Beatrice, passed the gene to the Spanish royal family. Her son, Alfonso XIII, inherited the crown and passed the mutation to two of his sons. One of them died from internal bleeding after a car accident. Though Spain's monarchy didn't fall immediately, it became a fragile institution, plagued by scandal, succession issues, and exile. The silent gene lingered like a shadow across generations. The German Empire collapsed at the end of World War I. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Victoria's grandson, did not suffer from hemophilia, but his extended family carried it. His mother, Victoria's daughter, was a known carrier. His own reign ended in exile, scandal, and defeat. Germany's monarchy was abolished. The grandmother of Europe had unintentionally passed not just blood, but vulnerability across the continent. It wasn't just hemophilia. It was the belief in purity that destroyed them. The obsession with divine bloodlines had created a brittle ruling class, one that could not adapt, could not modernize, and could not face its own decline. They had built fortresses of tradition and locked themselves inside. As revolutions stirred, republics rose, and wars reshaped the world. These royal families clung to old myths, but myths do not stop mutations. Titles do not stop bleeding, and divine right does not guarantee healthy sons. One gene passed silently through Victoria's descendants, unseen in the women who carried it, deadly in the boys who received it. An empire is not supposed to fall because a child gets hurt, but history is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it seeps slowly through generations, quietly undoing what crowns try to hold together. By the mid-20th century, most of Europe's great monarchies had vanished or diminished. Some fell in revolution, some faded into ceremonial roles, but nearly all carried scars left behind by choices made in golden courts when power was placed above biology and legacy above life. History leaves traces. In letters, in portraits, in crumbling ruins. But some of its most powerful secrets are buried deeper in the marrow of bones, in the spiral of genes, in the quiet code written inside every royal corpse. For centuries, monarchies carefully controlled their public images. They crafted legacies with paintings and speeches, marriages and monuments. But no matter how much they tried to shape the narrative, the truth never really disappeared. It just waited, underground, and now, in laboratories across Europe. That truth is being read for the first time, not by priests, not by scribes, but by geneticists. In 2012, beneath a parking lot in Leicester, England, archaeologists uncovered a skeleton, curved spine, slender frame, a blade wound to the skull. They believed it might be Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, killed in battle in 1485. DNA testing confirmed it, and with that confirmation came something else: scoliosis. For centuries, Richard had been portrayed as twisted, deformed, a villain with a crooked back. Historians debated whether this was Tudor propaganda, but his spine told the truth. He suffered from severe adolescent onset scoliosis, a genetic condition, not a monster, not a myth. A young king with a painful, curving body, pushed into a violent end. His bones had the final say. In recent decades, geneticists have studied portraits, autopsy records, and family trees of the Habsburg dynasty. What artists once softened with brushstrokes, science has sharpened with clarity. The Habsburg jaw, officially mandibular prognathism, was not legend, it was inherited, and it worsened across generations. Modern genetic modeling confirmed what Charles II's face showed so clearly. This wasn't a coincidence. It was the direct result of inbreeding, generations of it, the same families marrying again and again, until the jaw collapsed, the speech faltered, and the body followed. Hemophilia itself cannot be confirmed post-mortem in skeletal remains. But we now know, through family linkage studies and preserved royal medical records, that Queen Victoria's descendants carried the mutation. Alexei Romanov's case is perhaps the most documented. Bleeding episodes recorded in court journals, medical reports from palace physicians, letters between Alexandra and Victoria filled with fear and silent pleading. Romanov remains were tested in the 1990s after their secret burial site was uncovered. Mitochondrial DNA confirmed the family line. Modern science closed the case. History tried to bury. They cannot speak, but they carry stories that no monarch could silence. The cranium of a boy whose brain was soft as butter, Charles II. The spine of a king who was twisted by nature, not evil, Richard III. The genetic chain that linked empires from Britain to Russia through one grandmother's blood. These are not accusations, they are confirmations. History finally told without fear. Truth finally shown without illusion. And in that quiet truth, there is something almost sacred. Because when we read the bones of kings, we do not diminish their legacy. We understand it. We complete it, not with crowns, but with chromosomes. The crowns are lighter now. Monarchs no longer rule armies. They don't declare war or govern by decree. Their power is ceremonial, symbolic, a performance of continuity, grace, and heritage. But heritage is exactly what haunts them, because even today, royal families walk a line between tradition and survival. And though modern science now names the dangers their ancestors refused to face, one truth remains. The blood remembers. After the tragedies of Charles II, Victoria's hemophilic heirs, and the Romanovs' royal houses began, quietly, cautiously, to adapt. They stopped marrying close cousins. They introduced genetic screenings, often before engagements. In private, doctors offered advice on compatibility, fertility, and family health. No announcements were made, no press releases. But behind palace gates, precautions were taken. In the British royal family, hemophilia has not reappeared for generations, likely because Victoria's known carrier daughters were carefully tracked, and the line was allowed to thin. But in other monarchies, stories linger, heirs born with rare conditions that are never fully explained. Sudden shifts in marriage, arrangements. Children kept away from public view for long stretches of time, medical advisors joining royal councils, without titles or roles. None of this is spoken aloud, but nothing in royalty ever is. The idea of a flawed bloodline still carries a quiet weight, not in genetics, but in image. An image, for monarchies, is everything. In today's world, secrets don't stay hidden for centuries. There are no priests to protect the narrative, no artists to paint a softer jaw, No armies to silence rumor. A single photograph, a leaked medical document, or a genetic test shared online can rewrite perception in a day. So modern royals manage more than just state functions. They manage their DNA, carefully, cautiously, privately. Many royal families now marry outside traditional noble circles, a strategic move towards stronger, more diverse genetics. But the pressure remains. Heirs are still expected. Bloodlines are still traced. And even in this age of science, some decisions are still made based on who carries what, not just in name, but in code. Today's palaces are filled with light, cameras, journalists, documentaries, smiling public figures. But some rooms remain closed. Some conversations remain unrecorded, because even in the age of genome mapping, some truths remain too intimate, too heavy, for the public to hold. And so the blood remains tested, watched, calculated, but not spoken of. Not because of shame, but because of memory. The memory of kings who drooled on golden thrones, of boys who bled in silence, of mothers who prayed over cribs and crypts. The monarchies that still stand today, leaner, quieter, modern, are not unaware. They know what was nearly lost. They know how it happened, and in their silence, they remember. In every royal palace, there are mirrors older than memory. They've seen generations pass, queens crowned, kings buried, children born into velvet. They've reflected the finest gowns, the most gilded smiles. But they've also seen something else. The quiet limp of a sickly heir, the trembling hand beneath a silk glove, the tight-lipped mother watching a nurse carry her only son away. Royal blood is not like ours, they once believed. It was sacred, set apart, chosen by God, above question, beyond doubt. But blood does not care for thrones. It remembers what we try to forget. It records everything. A twisted jaw, a silent cry, a boy who bruises from love to rough, Charles II's broken body, Alexi's bleeding knees, Victoria's daughters carrying a ghost they could not see. They were not cursed, they were not punished. They were human, and in their humanity, they were fragile. For centuries, the idea of monarchy rested on a lie, that noble blood meant noble strength, that purity meant power, that history could be controlled from a throne. But the body cannot be ruled. It obeys no crown. It bows to no title. It speaks in whispers, and sometimes in screams. And yet, in their pain, these royals became something unexpected, not symbols of perfection, but reminders of limits. That power is never invincible. That even palaces echo with the sound of a child's suffering. That no name, no crest, no legacy is immune to nature's quiet laws. Today, their portraits still hang. Their names still grace the halls. Their stories, softened by time, still fill the pages of history. But behind every oil painting, behind every crown jewel, there is always one last truth. The blood remembers, and when history forgets, the bones will speak. A final whisper, a final warning, a final fragile legacy.